The dog smelled it before Clint did. That was always the way with Duke. The big German shepherd had been doing it for 11 years, stopping, lifting his nose, reading the air like a sentence the rest of the world hadn't learned to speak yet. Clint Mercer had stopped doubting him somewhere around Kandahar. By the time they both got home, or whatever passed for home after everything, trusting Duke wasn't a habit anymore. It was just breathing. Clint stepped off the Greyhound in Beaumont, Texas at 4:30 on a Tuesday morning in late October. The bus stop was a gas station with 2 flickering lights and a clerk behind bulletproof glass who didn't look up. Duke landed beside him on the concrete, shook himself once, and sat. They both looked at the street the same way, not scared, just reading it. Clint was 53 years old. He had $240 in his wallet, a military backpack that had been to 3 countries, and no address to write on a form. He hadn't had one in 8 months. Before that, a couch in his brother's house in Odessa. Before that, a place of his own that stopped being a place once the lease and the savings and the will to maintain either of them ran out at roughly the same time. He didn't feel sorry for himself about it, or he'd stopped feeling sorry for himself about it. He couldn't always tell the difference. He had been a Navy SEAL for 14 years. He had done things most people would spend the rest of their lives trying to forget. The problem was, when you came back, the things didn't stay over there. They came with you. They rode the same Greyhound, ate at the same truck stops, slept in the same parking lots. Clint's therapist, back when he'd had one, called it hypervigilance. Clint called it Tuesday. Duke pressed against his leg just once. A reminder. "I know," Clint said. "I'm working on it." He had a name, one name written on the back of a gas receipt in his shirt pocket. A man named Ed Cawley, who ran a marina on the Neches River, about 4 miles from where they were standing. Ed had put a handwritten ad on a veterans forum 3 weeks ago. Work available. Bunkhouse on site. Dogs welcome. Clint had read it 6 times before he let himself believe it might be real. He called. Ed picked up on the second ring and talked for 45 minutes about catfish and river tides and a dock that needed rebuilding. Clint mostly listened. He was good at listening. Ed hadn't asked what Clint had done before, or why he needed the bunkhouse, or anything that would have required Clint to explain himself. At the end of the call, Ed had said, "Show up whenever. Place'll be here." Clint figured whenever was now. They walked the 4 miles. Duke didn't mind. Neither did Clint, really. Walking was the one thing that still felt clean. The marina was smaller than Clint had expected, and exactly what he needed it to be. A gravel lot. A wooden dock that sagged slightly to the left. 3 aluminum fishing boats tied up in a row, one of them covered in a blue tarp that had seen better years. A bait shop with a hand-painted sign. Behind it, a long, low building that must have been the bunkhouse, with a screen door that banged softly in the morning wind off the river. Ed Cawley came out of the bait shop holding a coffee mug and squinting at them. He was maybe 70 brown and weathered like driftwood, wearing a canvas vest with too many pockets. He looked at Duke first, then at Clint, then back at Duke. "That's a serious dog," Ed said. "Yes, sir." "What's his name?" "Duke." Ed nodded slowly, like that settled something. "You hungry?" "We're all right." "That's not what I asked." They ate scrambled eggs at a folding table inside the bait shop while Ed explained the work. The dock needed 2 new sections. One of the John boats had a slow leak that needed patching. There was a storage shed out back that had partly collapsed in August, and nobody had gotten around to it. Basic maintenance. Basic labor. In exchange, the bunkhouse, which had a cot and a hot plate and a shower that ran warm if you gave it a minute. And $60 a week, which Ed said apologetically wasn't much. Clint said it was enough. Duke ate out of a bowl Ed produced from under the counter without being asked. Clint noted that. A man who kept a dog bowl under the counter was a certain kind of man. The kind of man Clint had learned to relax around. He started on the dock that same afternoon. The first 2 weeks were simple. Good, even. Clint worked with his hands, which had always been how he thought best. Duke explored the property in widening circles, cataloging smells, establishing what was his to watch over. Ed left them largely alone, appearing occasionally with unsolicited sandwiches, or to comment on the dock work in a way that was more appreciation than critique. Clint slept better than he had in months. Not well, but better. Duke slept across the doorway of the bunkhouse, like he always did, and that helped. On the 16th day, Clint noticed the boat. It was moored at the far end of the dock, past the aluminum john boats, in a slip that was half hidden by an overgrowth of willows that came down to the water. He'd walked past it a dozen times without really looking at it. Some part of his brain had filed it under not my business and moved on. But that morning the sun hit it differently, and he stopped. It was a wooden cabin cruiser, maybe 35 feet. Old, really old. The kind of old that meant 1960s construction and no fiberglass anywhere. The hull had been white once. Now it was the color of things left in the rain for years, gray-green below the waterline, chalky and peeling above it. One of the cabin windows was boarded over with plywood. The roof of the small wheelhouse had a visible dent. A rope hung off the stern that had long ago stopped being attached to anything useful. It was the ugliest boat Clint had ever seen. Duke was standing at the end of the dock, looking at it. "You think something's in there?" Clint said. Duke didn't answer, obviously, but he didn't move either. Just kept looking. That evening, Clint asked Ed about it. Ed set down his coffee mug. He seemed to consider how much to say. "Belonged to a man named Curtis Odom," he finally said. "Lived on it for about 6 years, right there in that slip. Before my time running this place. He died. Must be 12 years ago now. Left the boat to nobody in particular. His family didn't want it. County didn't want it. It's just been sitting. Who owns it? Technically the estate. Practically speaking, nobody." Clint looked out the window toward the willows. "It's going to sink eventually. Probably." Ed picked his mug back up. "You want it?" Clint looked at him. "I can make some calls," Ed said. "Get the estate to sign it over for $1. Probably less. They'd be glad to stop thinking about it." He shrugged. "Or I can just keep watching it rot. Either way." That night, Clint lay on the cot and stared at the ceiling for a while. He was good at making rapid decisions under pressure. That was the training. What he was not good at was making slow decisions about things that required him to want something. Wanting things had gotten complicated, but Duke had stood at the end of that dock and looked at the boat, and Clint had learned not to ignore that. In the morning, he told Ed to make the call. He got the boat for $1 and a signed form that took 3 weeks to process. While he waited, he started working on it anyway. Ed didn't ask him to stop. The first thing was the bilge. Clint pumped it out, which took most of a morning, and discovered that the hull was sound. Old, but sound. Curtis Odom, whoever he'd been, had built her to last. The second thing was clearing out the cabin, which was where it got interesting. The inside of the cabin cruiser smelled like a closed attic, like cedar and old machine oil and time. Whoever had cleaned it out after Curtis died had done an incomplete job. There were still things. A rusted coffee percolator on the tiny galley counter. A stack of fishing magazines from the 1990s. A folding chair with a cracked leg. Some rope. A life preserver that had gone orange with age. And in the forward berth, under a bunk that folded against the wall, a door. Not a storage hatch. Clint had expected those. This was a small door, maybe 18 inches square, set into the hull below the waterline compartment. It had a padlock on it. Old brass, corroded green. Duke found it before Clint did. Clint had been working at the other end of the cabin when he heard Duke make the sound. Not a bark, not quite a whine. The low sound he made when he was telling Clint to come here and pay attention. Clint came. Duke was sitting in front of the bunk, nose pointed down at the floor. Clint crouched down. He pulled the bunk away from the wall. He saw the door. He sat with it for a minute. The padlock was old. He could have broken it in 30 seconds. but something made him slow down. The same instinct that made you clear a room methodically instead of rushing. You don't always know what you're about to find. He went and got a pry bar from his toolbox. Came back, worked the lock slowly until the hasp gave. Then he opened the door. Inside was a metal box, the kind with a hinged lid, about the size of a shoebox. Military green, with a stenciled name on the lid that had faded to near illegibility. He brought it out into the light. He couldn't read the name. He set the box on the bunk and looked at it for a moment. Duke sat beside him. Inside the box, a bundle of letters tied with kitchen twine, the paper gone amber with age. 3 photographs, black and white, of a young man in a Navy uniform standing in front of an aircraft carrier. A purple heart medal in a hinged case. A folded piece of paper that turned out to be a discharge document from 1968. Issued to a petty officer second class named Curtis Elmore Odom, United States Navy. And underneath all of it, a letter. Handwritten, different paper, newer than the rest. Dated 2006. Clint read it. Curtis Odom had been 22 years old when he came back from Vietnam. According to the letter, which he had written to himself, or to anyone who would eventually find the box, with a directness that felt like someone who had decided to be honest about things that were hard. He had come back to a country that did not know what to do with him. His family had tried. His wife had tried. He had not been able to tell any of them what had happened over there, and the not telling had eventually taken everything. He had bought the boat in 1998. The letter didn't say why except for one sentence. The water doesn't expect anything from me. He had lived on it for 6 years. He had fished and done odd jobs around the marina and kept to himself. He wrote that he didn't have much, but he had gotten used to that. He wrote that some mornings, watching the mist come off the river, he felt something close to peace. He wrote that he was sorry to the people he'd let down and that he had tried later in his life to make some of it right, though he wasn't sure he'd managed. At the end of the letter he had written, "If you're reading this, it means I didn't get around to throwing it away. That means you found it, and I'm gone. I don't know who you are. But if you ended up on this boat, you probably needed somewhere to land. I hope it's good to you. It was good to me." CEO Clint read it twice. Then he folded it carefully and put it back in the box. He sat on the bunk for a long time. Duke put his head in Clint's lap, which was something he only did when he'd decided it was necessary. Clint put his hand on the dog's head and didn't move for a while. Outside, the river moved the way it always did, patient, not going anywhere. He didn't tell Ed about the box right away. He needed to sit with it first. That was a thing he'd learned. Some things needed to be sat with before they could be shared. He kept working on the boat. He replaced the plywood over the window with actual glass he sourced from a salvage yard in town. He patched the roof of the wheelhouse. He sanded and repainted sections of the hull, working his way from bow to stern over 3 weeks, Duke lying on the dock watching him with the philosophical patience that large dogs sometimes have. He fixed the engine, which was simpler than it looked because Curtis Odom had kept it meticulously maintained for years before whatever happened toward the end. The boat started to look like something again. Ed came down one afternoon and stood at the end of the dock, looking at it with his hands in his pockets. "She's coming along," he said. "Yes, sir. You planning to live on her?" Clint thought about it. Not the way he used to think about things, carefully from a distance, like he was assessing a situation that didn't involve him. He just thought about it. "Maybe," he said. "Bunkhouse will still be here if you change your mind. I know." Clint set down the sanding block. "Ed, the man who owned this boat before. Curtis Odom. You know anything about his family?" Ed looked at him. "A little. Why?" "He left some things in it. Personal things. I think someone should know they're here." Ed was quiet for a moment. "His daughter," he said finally, "Irene. She lives over in Vidor. She and her father, they weren't close, end of his life. I got the feeling there was some hurt there that never got settled." He paused. She called once, few years after he passed, just asking if anything was left. I told her no because as far as I knew, nothing was. Clint nodded. You have a number for her? He drove out to Vidor on a Saturday. It was a 40-minute drive through flat East Texas country. Pine trees and mobile homes and feed stores. The kind of landscape that was easy to underestimate. Duke rode in the passenger seat with his head out the window, which he was technically too old for, and did anyway. Irene bachelor now, lived in a small brick house with a vegetable garden running along the side fence. She was around 60, with gray in her hair, and a careful, composed way of holding herself that reminded Clint of people who had gotten used to being disappointed and decided to be dignified about it. She looked at him through the screen door for a moment before opening it. You said on the phone you found something that belonged to my father, she said. Yes, ma'am. She looked at Duke. That's a big dog. He's gentle. She opened the door wider. Come in then. He set the metal box on her kitchen table. She looked at it for a moment without touching it. Then she sat down. She went through it slowly. The photographs first. She held each one for a long time, her face doing things Clint looked away from because they were private. The Purple Heart, which she opened and closed 3 times. The discharge papers. The letters, which she didn't read yet, just held. And then the letter. She read it twice, same as Clint had. When she put it down, she wasn't crying, but the effort of not crying was visible. She pressed her hands flat on the table. He was a hard man to know, she said. Yes, ma'am. I think the war made him harder. He didn't talk about it. No, they mostly didn't. She looked at him, really looked like she was registering something. You're a veteran. Navy. Something shifted in her expression. Not pity, something more complicated than that. Recognition, maybe. My father couldn't figure out how to come home, she said. A lot of them couldn't. Could you? The question sat there between them. Duke had gone over to lie by the back door, the way he did in unfamiliar houses, politely out of the way. Clint watched him for a second. I'm working on it, he said, which was the same thing he'd said to Duke at the bus stop months ago, and he realized saying it again that it was the most honest thing he'd said to anyone in a long time. Irene nodded slowly. She reached out and put her hand briefly over the closed metal box. Thank you for bringing this, she said. I didn't know I was waiting for it. He drove back to the marina as the sun went down over the pines, painting everything amber. Duke fell asleep in the passenger seat, which he almost never did in a moving vehicle. So Clint figured the day had been a lot for both of them. He sat on the dock that night for a long time, just listening to the river. There is a particular sound that moving water makes in the dark. Not silence, exactly, but a kind of steady patience that wears down the sharper edges of things if you sit with it long enough. He thought about Curtis Odom, who had found his way to this same water, this same quiet, and had landed here after a long time of not having anywhere to land. He thought about the letter. If you ended up on this boat, you probably needed somewhere to land. He thought that was probably the most accurate thing anyone had ever said about him without knowing him at all. In November, a man named Roy Stinson showed up at the marina. He was 48 years old, had been an Army Ranger, and was living out of his truck. Ed knew him slightly, a friend of someone from the county VFW post. Ed had told him about Clint without asking Clint's permission, which Clint probably would have objected to if it hadn't turned out to be the right thing. Roy had a look that Clint recognized immediately, the way you recognized it when you'd worn it yourself. The look of a man still running from something inside his own head, moving constantly because stopping felt dangerous. Clint showed him around the marina. Ed let him sleep in the bunkhouse. Duke assessed him thoroughly and apparently decided he was acceptable, which Clint took as a good sign. 3 weeks after Roy arrived, a woman named Louise Hackett came. She'd been a Navy corpsman, 2 tours in Iraq, and she'd ended up in Beaumont the way a lot of people ended up places, following a chain of one thing after another until the chain ran out. She was 44, and she laughed at things that weren't funny, which Clint recognized as armor, because he'd worn that too. The boat was finished by then, or finished enough. Clint had moved onto it in late October. He'd hung Curtis Odom's Purple Heart on the wall of the cabin, in a small frame, in the place where you put something that deserves to be seen. The boat rode well, and the engine ran, and the river outside the porthole made the same sound at night that it had always made. He still didn't know exactly what to call what was happening at the marina. Ed Colley had started letting people stay without charging them anything, which Ed said was just sensible, since the bunkhouse had been sitting empty before Clint showed up, and would have gone on sitting empty. Roy was helping with maintenance. Louise had turned out to be quietly good at things, fixing the generator, organizing the bait shop inventory, talking to the VFW people in town about resources that veterans could actually use. It wasn't a program. It didn't have a name. It was just a place where the water didn't expect anything from you, and the dog would tell you if something needed your attention, and there was work to do with your hands, and you could sleep at night with a door between you and whatever was outside. Some mornings Clint sat in the wheelhouse with his coffee and watched the mist come off the Neches, the same mist Curtis Odom had watched for 6 years, and he thought about the word home. It was a word he'd treated carefully for a long time, the way you treat a thing that's broken you before. You don't pick it up casually. You test the weight of it first. But there was something happening here that he didn't have a better word for. Roy and Louise and Ed and the river and Duke sleeping on the deck in the morning sun, getting gray around the muzzle now, occasionally deigning to let Louise scratch his ears, which was a significant concession from a dog of his dignity. The sound of hammering when the dock needed work, the smell of coffee from the bait shop. Irene Batchelor, who came down from Vidor one Sunday, with a pound cake she didn't explain, and stayed for 3 hours talking to Ed while Clint worked on the engine, and who left looking slightly lighter than when she'd arrived. The box was still on the shelf in the cabin, next to the Purple Heart. Curtis Odom's last letter was in it, with the photographs and the twine-wrapped letters he'd written to people who may or may not have known what to do with them. Clint had read the other letters eventually, over several nights, one at a time. They were to his ex-wife, to Irene, to a man named Doyle, who might have been a friend from the service. They were the kind of letters you write when you know you waited too long, but you write them anyway, because the alternative is leaving the words inside you where they turn into something you can't manage. Clint thought he understood that. He'd started a letter of his own, just one, to his brother in Odessa, who had given him a couch when he needed it and hadn't asked questions, and who Clint had thanked inadequately and too infrequently. He hadn't sent it yet, but he was going to. That was different from where he'd been. Duke came and sat beside him one afternoon while he was working on it, the way he always came and sat when he felt Clint needed the company. The dog was getting old. 11 years was a long time for a German shepherd, especially one who had spent years doing the work Duke had done. He moved a little more carefully than he used to. He slept more, but his eyes were the same, steady and dark and entirely sure of what they were looking at. Clint set down his pen and put his hand on the dog's side and felt him breathe. The river moved outside. The dock made its small sounds. Somewhere in the bait shop, Ed was telling Roy something about catfish that Roy was probably going to forget and Ed was going to tell him again. Clint Mercer had come off a Greyhound 8 months ago with $240 and no address and a dog who knew things before he did. He had found a boat that somebody needed to find. He had found what was inside it. And he had begun to understand slowly, in the way that only slow things are actually true, that finding something doesn't always mean you were looking for it. Sometimes it means it was waiting.